Okay, so here's a thought. What if some of the greatest stories humanity has ever told, from ancient myths passed down through generations to those literary classics we all maybe struggled through in school, what if they were actually fan fiction? And
Hmm.
what if this thing we do now, writing fan fiction, which sometimes gets underestimated, what if it's actually a profound continuation of our oldest storytelling traditions?
That is a truly captivating thought, isn't it? Really makes you stop and think. The whole idea, it just challenges our usual ways of thinking about, well, creativity, who owns a story, even what narrative is.
Right.
We tend to put things in neat boxes,
Yeah.
but when you actually look closely at the history of stories, those lines get really blurry, really fast. It reveals this much richer, more connected kind of tapestry.
That's exactly right. So, welcome everyone to a deep dive into the fascinating world of fan fiction. Today, we're going to explore how fan fiction is honestly far more than just some niche activity or a hobby for a few people. It's actually a powerful cultural force, and it's deeply tangled up with these fundamental questions about ownership, about creativity, and maybe most surprisingly, how, yes, you listening right now, how you perceive and engage with the stories around you, maybe every single day.
Yeah, our mission today is really to peel back the rich layers of fan fiction. We want to move beyond just like simple definitions and really uncover its unexpected cultural significance.
Okay.
We'll definitely get into the complex, sometimes murky legal landscape it has to navigate, especially around intellectual property. That's a big one.
Huge.
And then we'll introduce this truly groundbreaking idea, something called the fanfic lens. The theory here is that actually writing fan fiction fundamentally changes how the creators consume all media, not just their fandoms, but everything.
Yeah.
It alters their whole perception of storytelling.
Wow, okay. So, to guide us through this intricate narrative landscape, we'll be drawing insights from a few key sources. There's this really vibrant Reddit discussion that sparked some incredible points about fan fiction's role in culture.
Yeah, that was fascinating.
Then, a detailed legal analysis that really dissects the intellectual property stuff in fascinating detail.
Gets into the weeds.
And finally, a rigorous academic study. This one empirically examines the profound and lasting impact fanfic writing has on how people consume media. So yeah, prepare to have your understanding of stories and maybe your own relationship to them thoroughly reevaluated.
So let's start with a statement that really gets to the provocative core of our discussion today.
Mm.
It kind of sets the stage for seeing fan fiction not just as this modern thing, but as a manifestation of, well, ancient storytelling.
Okay, lay it on us. This quote really stands out because it challenges our basic assumptions about who gets to own stories. It's from Henry Jenkins. He was the director of media studies at MIT back in 1997. He said, and I quote, "Fan fiction is a way of the culture repairing the damage done in a system where contemporary myths are owned by corporations instead of owned by the moke."
That quote is incredibly potent. It really reframes the entire discussion, doesn't it? Jenkins' argument, essentially, is that in our current media world, the really powerful, widely shared stories are contemporary myths, as he calls them.
Like Star Wars, Marvel.
Exactly. Harry
Yeah.
Potter, these huge franchises. They're tightly controlled corporate assets now.
Mhm.
And that's a huge shift from how stories traditionally worked.
Right.
So from this viewpoint, fan fiction isn't just like a side effect of modern media. It's actually a necessary cultural response. It's like a collective immune system kicking in.
Huh. Repairing the damage.
Yeah, it's how people reclaim, re-engage with, and basically repair narratives that they feel have been maybe appropriated or limited by that corporate ownership. It's about making them feel communal again, owned by the folk.
And what's really compelling about that perspective, something a very thoughtful Reddit user pointed out eloquently, is that this isn't new. Humans have always done this.
Absolutely.
I mean, think about it. How many versions of Cinderella are there? Across cultures, centuries, hundreds probably.
Literally hundreds, yeah.
Or Pinocchio, or Romeo and Juliet. It's not just a few examples. It's basically the default mode for how stories have survived and evolved through history. They get retold, adapted, reinterpreted constantly, changing as they travel.
Precisely. Before we had mass commercialization, before easily copy-printed books, stories weren't really commodities. They were living things.
Yeah.
Myths, tales, they were shared orally around campfires, in villages,
Just down.
passed down, exactly. And crucially, there wasn't one single definitive canon. There was no copyright holder policing it.
Right.
Each person who retold the story added their own spin, their own experiences, slight variations, and the beautiful essential part. All those versions were valid. They were correct in their own context.
Wow.
The story's survival wasn't about legal protection. It depended entirely on resonance. Did it connect with the audience? Did it speak to something human? If yes, it got told again. If not, it faded. That communal, adaptive way of storytelling was the norm for thousands of years.
So when you look at it like that, through this historical lens, fan fiction isn't just some niche hobby people do online. It's like an intrinsic human impulse. It's our birthright as storytellers, as that Reddit user put it so perfectly.
That's a great phrase.
It's this primal urge to take a story that hits us, internalize it, and then make it our own somehow, to explore its hidden corners, adapt it, just engage with narrative in this really fundamental participatory way, like cultural breathing, almost. Inhale the story, process it, exhale it anew.
Indeed. And in that light, fan fiction emerges not as some strange anomaly, but as a clever loophole, maybe in our modern system where big corporations own the big narratives.
Yeah.
It's often called the people's art, right? Because it thrives outside those traditional commercial structures.
Yeah.
And the historical parallels are just striking. Like one Reddit user said, provocatively but insightfully, Dante's Inferno is literally fanfic.
Okay, explain that one.
Well, Dante took established religious narratives, figures like Virgil, the whole cosmology of heaven, purgatory, hell, things people already knew, and then he creatively reinterpreted and expanded on them to make something totally new and transformative.
Right, using existing canon.
Exactly. And that poem is now a cornerstone of Western literature, created long before modern copyright even existed. It just shows that this kind of creative reinterpretation is timeless.
Okay, but this powerful idea that corporations might be damaging storytelling or owning myths through copyright, that immediately sparks a big debate, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely.
Could it be that, capitalism itself isn't the villain here? Or maybe it's actually an enabler of storytelling, just in a different, perhaps more expansive way? Some Reddit users push back on Jenkins's quote, arguing for, well, more nuance.
It's a critical counterpoint, absolutely needs exploring. Some argue that capitalism hasn't fundamentally ruined storytelling per se, but maybe it has encouraged mediocrity.
How so?
By prioritizing short-term profit and mass appeal over, say, genuine artistic merit or risk-taking. It's a subtle but important distinction. In this feeling of guilt some fanfic writers talk about, it's not necessarily about capitalism itself. It often comes from this deep-seated societal idea that originality is king, and anything derivative is somehow lesser, less valuable.
Yeah, that pressure.
It's a complex individual thing, often clashing with that natural human impulse we just talked about, retelling stories. For many writers, fan fiction is just a natural creative outlet. It's not inherently weird or morally gray.
Right. And while we're on the blame game, some voices in the discussion pointed fingers not at capitalism broadly, but at very specific corporate actions they see as harmful. Like one user said pretty bluntly, Disney's the bastard who keeps getting copyright laws extended.
Yeah, that refers to things like the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act back in '98. People sometimes call it the Mickey Mouse Protection Act. It's significantly lengthened copyright terms.
Keeping things out of the public domain longer.
Exactly. That's a key distinction and a real concern for many. While the broad system of capitalism is debatable, these specific aggressive legal moves by powerful players like Disney to extend copyright terms potentially indefinitely. That's a tangible issue for people who think it unfairly stifles creativity. It locks away cultural works that, in earlier times, would have entered the public domain much sooner.
But you have to acknowledge, copyright laws do serve a purpose, right? They support artists.
Absolutely a crucial point. They provide a legal framework for creators to profit from their work, to invest in new projects, and from that perspective, non-commercial fan fiction, the stuff not being sold, often provides, essentially, free marketing.
Right, it keeps the buzz going.
Or it just keeps the original IP relevant in people's minds. It fosters engagement. And that's a big reason why these large corporations, even with all their legal power, rarely go after non-commercial fanfic authors. It's usually not in their best interest to alienate a passionate fan base is basically doing free promo work and keeping their property culturally alive.
This also brings up that interesting and pretty controversial case of Anne Rice. She famously took a really hard line against fan interpretations of her work, even threatening legal action.
Right, a very different stance.
Which contrasts so sharply with many fan writers who genuinely see themselves as supporters, not infringers. They feel like they're keeping the flame alive for a story they love, maybe even extending its life.
It really highlights this fundamental, often emotional tension, doesn't it? The author's perceived absolute control versus the audience's desire to engage, reinterpret, extend. And then there's the economic argument. Artists need to eat.
Yeah, the practical reality.
Historically, many great artists, Shakespeare, Michelangelo, Mozart, they either worked for patrons who commissioned their art or they came from wealth.
Mm.
Art has always been tied to some kind of market exchange or patronage system. It's not some new phenomenon unique to modern capitalism. Creators have always needed resources to create.
Yeah. And this is where we need to be careful with terms, as one Reddit user pointed out. We shouldn't just lump capitalism, which is a specific economic system, private ownership of production, profit motive, together with simple trade or a market economy. Those have existed for millennia, way before capitalism as we know it.
Absolutely. Critical distinction. Spreading misinformation there doesn't help. A market economy is just supply and demand, exchange of goods and services. It's ancient. Capitalism is much more recent. Private capital accumulation, wage labor, production for profit.
Okay.
So when we think about profit in modern storytelling, the argument is that these massive cultural touchstones, Star Wars, MCU, Game of Thrones, they just wouldn't exist in their current form without the huge financial incentives and speculative investment driven by profit motives.
They're enormous productions.
Solidly. Multi-billion-dollar undertakings that need massive upfront investment, complex production, global distribution. The whole idea of the pure artist, creating only for art's sake, ignoring financial viability. It's often challenged as a romantic myth. Many classics we love today, Shakespeare's plays were popular entertainment. Dickens' novels were serialized commercial ventures. They were designed to reach an audience and often, yes, turn a profit in their time.
So if that's the case, what about the argument that originality is basically a capitalist myth to justify copyright abuse? That viewpoint suggests the current copyright system, instead of fostering creativity, actually hinders it by keeping ideals out of the public domain, stopping cultural development.
Right.
It paints capitalism as creating these gatekeepers, these barriers, all driven by profit, leading to, well, formulaic cookie-cutter media. Studios just follow the leader, investing only in what's already proven safe and successful.
That's a strong critique. It suggests the system stifles real innovation in favor of just replicating past successes. That the real damage is limiting the remixing and reinterpretation that naturally happens in a healthy culture. But there's a powerful counterpoint.
Which is?
Which is that all media, including fan fiction itself, follows established formulas and tropes, narrative structures, character archetypes, genre conventions. These are patterns all storytellers use, consciously or not.
True.
So the question becomes, if there were no profit incentives, would we even get these huge, ambitious narratives like Star Wars or Game of Thrones with their incredible scope and production value in the first place?
Maybe not.
And without those foundational works, what would fan fiction even build on?
Yeah.
The economic reality of large-scale media is undeniable, and you could argue that profit incentives can also drive innovation by allowing for bigger risks, bigger projects that might otherwise be impossible.
Okay, this leads right into that passion versus skill debate. Is fan fiction, because it's born out of love for the art, somehow inherently better than mass-produced corporate stuff that might be more market-driven? Someone compared it to a home-cooked meal versus a microwave dinner. The love makes it better, right?
It's a really compelling, relatable metaphor. It captures the emotional value people place on fan works. But the counter-argument is equally strong, that skill is far more important than passion when it comes down to the actual quality and impact of the work.
Ooh.
Passion can definitely fuel a project, drive perseverance, but it doesn't guarantee literary quality, coherent storytelling, or artistic merit on its own. History is full of highly regarded works created with maybe very little personal passion, commissions, obligations, and conversely, countless passion projects, fanfic or otherwise, have floundered due to a lack of basic writing skill, structure, or execution.
The skill is the foundation.
This view suggests true artistic merit needs a blend. But skill and craft are the non-negotiable foundation for lasting work, regardless of the initial inspiration. Passion alone isn't enough.
All right, so that's the really rich, sometimes quite contentious, cultural and philosophical side of fan fiction. We've seen how deep its roots go in human storytelling. But now, let's step into the legal minefield. How exactly does the law see fan fiction? What are the intricate IP implications? This feels like where it gets really tricky.
Yeah, legally speaking, fan fiction is generally defined as stories created by fans using characters, settings, and plots from original works. That definition itself immediately puts it under the umbrella of what the law calls derivative works.
Derivative works, meaning?
Meaning new works that are based on or derived from existing copyrighted material. And that's the crucial starting point for understanding its legal status, because derivative works have this unique position in copyright law.
And this is where something called the Berne Convention comes in, which is like this big international agreement.
Exactly. Widely adopted US, EU, China, most countries are signatories. So its principles are pretty much global. Article 2 of Berne says that things like translations, adaptations, arrangements, and other alterations of works, they shall be protected as original works themselves.
So fan fiction can be copyrighted?
Yes, but, and this is the huge caveat, without prejudice to the copyright of the original work. Your copyrighting your fanfic doesn't override or diminish the original creator's rights.
Okay.
The key is demonstrating unique creative output beyond just copying. Copyright law's standard for originality is actually much lower than, say, patent law's standard for novelty. It doesn't judge literary merit or artistic quality. It just requires that the work isn't a direct copy and shows some minimal creative input from the author.
So if you just typed out Harry Potter word for word, no copyright for you.
Definitely not.
But if you wrote a new story about Harry Potter in a different scenario, your specific words and plot choices could be considered original enough for your own copyright.
That's the idea, yeah. Even though it's based on something else, your contribution can be protected, provided it meets that minimum originality threshold. This leads to a really crucial distinction, especially when money gets involved. Derivative versus non-derivative fan fiction.
Okay, break that down. What's the difference?
Non-derivative fan fiction is where the author has transformed the original source so much that it effectively becomes a new work.
Yeah.
It sheds most, if not all, of the original copyrighted elements.
Like filing off the serial numbers.
Pretty much. The absolute classic example is 50 Shades of Grey. It famously started as Twilight fan fiction called Master of the Universe.
Right, I remember that.
E.L. James deliberately went through and removed all the directly copyrighted stuff. Bella, Edward, the vampire werewolf lore, the specific settings like Forks. She rewrote them into new characters, a new universe, even though the core relationship dynamic might feel familiar.
And that worked, legally.
It did. That transformation allowed it to be published commercially, become a massive bestseller, all without facing copyright lawsuits from the Twilight folks. It demonstrated enough independent creative expression.
Wow. That's a powerful example of how fanfic can evolve. But then there's derivative fanfiction, which is probably what most people think of stories using Harry Potter or Star Wars characters' settings.
Yes, exactly. This type directly builds on and retains those existing copyrighted elements, the characters as we know them, the established settings, recognizable plots. It might transform them in new ways, AUS, different pairings, filling gaps, but it fundamentally has to respect the original work's exclusive rights.
And this is where most fanfic lives, in that legal gray area.
Overwhelmingly, yes. It's walking a fine line. It's mostly tolerated because it's non-commercial and often seen as free promotion, building the fan base. But technically, yeah, a lot of it falls under the definition of infringement.
Which brings us right to the scary part, the shadow of copyright infringement. How do courts actually decide if a fanfic or any derivative work has crossed that line?
In practice, the legal test is often boiled down to access plus substantial similarity.
Access plus substantial similarity.
Okay. Fanfic writers are generally assumed to have access to the original intelliture. They're fans, they've read the book, seen the movie. So the real fight is usually over substantial similarity.
And what does that mean? Just copying words?
Not just words. It's about whether significant portions of the original are reproduced in a recognizable form. This can include plots, specific character traits and backstories, unique settings, even the overall total concept and feel. Courts look at both the quantity of what's taken and, crucially, the quality or significance of it.
So copying a really iconic element might be worse than copying a lot of minor details.
Potentially, yes. For example, there was a case, Castle Rock Entertainment v. Carroll Publishing, involving a Seinfeld trivia book. It was found to infringe because it didn't just report facts, it reproduced substantial chunks of the show's dialogue and plot lines in a way that captured the show's creative expression.
Oh.
So, similarly, writing a new story, but using Sherlock Holmes's exact unique backstory, personality quirks, and distinctive dialogue patterns, that would likely be seen as substantially similar.
Got it. So it's not just the writing, but also sharing it online that can be an issue, like on AO3 or Wattpad.
Absolutely. This involves another exclusive right of copyright holders, the distribution right. Posting fanfic online on websites, forums, social media that technically counts as distributing copies to the public.
Even if no money changes hands.
Even then, making the work publicly available, whether people download it or just to read it online, potentially infringes the copyright holder's right to control how their work is disseminated. This is why the non-commercial nature of most fanfic is so vital for its continued existence, even if it's technically infringing. Rights holders tolerate it because it's not hurting their wallet and it builds community.
Okay, so that's the potential legal danger. But there's a big defense, right? The main shield for fan fiction, especially in the US, is fair use.
Indeed. Fair use is crucial. It allows limited use of copyrighted material without needing permission. It's designed to strike a balance between the rights of owners and the public's interest in things like creativity, commentary, criticism, education.
So it's like a safety valve.
Kind of, yeah. It's codified in U.S. law, but it's always decided on a case-by-case basis. There's no simple checklist. The absolute core principle, heavily emphasized by the Supreme Court in a case called Campbell v. Cuff Rose Music, which was about a musical parody, is whether the new work is transformative.
Transformative, meaning?
Meaning, does it add new expression, meaning, or message to the original? Does it do something new with it rather than just repackaging or substituting for it? The more transformative a fanfic is, the stronger its fair use claim. Parody is a classic example of transformative use.
So making something genuinely new out of the old, not just copying. What else do courts look at for fair use?
Another huge factor, arguably the most important for fan fiction, is the effect of the use upon the potential market for or value of the copyrighted work. Basically, the market impact.
Does the fanfic hurt the original sales?
Exactly. Does it compete with or diminish the market for the original work? Or for licensed things derived from it, like official sequels or merchandise? Generally, non-commercial fanfic, since it's not sold, is seen as less harmful to the market. It usually doesn't take sales away.
But if it gets popular, or especially if it's monetized,
then the risks go way up. Look at that Warner Bros. VRDR books case, again, the unauthorized Harry Potter lexicon. It was found to infringe partly because of its market impact. The court saw it as directly competing with the kind of official companion books Warner Bros. Could license or produce themselves.
It stepped on their potential market turf.
Precisely. Conversely, fanfic that does qualify as fair use is often seen not as a substitute, but as a complement to the original. It might actually increase interest, drive more sales for the original books or movies, rather than hurting them.
That's a really interesting dynamic. So commercial fan fiction that's inherently riskier for fair use seems like making money from it would be a big red flag.
Generally, yes. Commercial use weighs heavily against a finding of fair use. It's less likely to qualify. However, if the work involves significant transformations, that can help mitigate the negative impact of the commercial aspect.
Back to 50 Shades again.
Exactly. Unlike traditional fanfic, which often wants to be similar to the original to appeal to fans, commercial authors trying to avoid infringement deliberately strive to distance their work from the original. They make substantial changes to characters, settings, plot. They're trying to create a new, distinct market, not just piggyback on the old one.
But here's a surprising thing you mentioned. Even when unauthorized commercial fanfic gets popular, rights holders often don't sue. Why not? If they could, why wouldn't they? Especially if there's money involved.
There are a couple of really powerful reasons. First, as we said, successful commercialization, even unauthorized, can sometimes act as free publicity. It can attract more attention to the original works, potentially boosting their sales. It keeps the IP culturally relevant. 50 Shades arguably got people talking about Twilight again, even indirectly.
Free marketing, essentially.
In a way, yeah. And second, maybe more pragmatically, infringement lawsuits are incredibly expensive, they take a long time, and they're complex.
Right.
Proving infringement, especially with transformative works, can be really challenging and costly. Rights holders have to weigh the potential damages they might win against the huge legal fees and, importantly, the risk of alienating their core fan base by suing someone perceived as part of that community. Often, it's just not worth the fight.
That makes a lot of practical sense. So traditional fanfic needs to use a lot of the original to even be recognizable fanfic, which can be tricky for fair use.
Right. The amount and substantiality factor can weigh against it, even if it's non-commercial.
But commercial works try to minimize that similarity, and the courts might then focus more on the commercial gain and the market impact, maybe giving less weight to how much was actually borrowed if the transformation is significant.
Precisely. For non-commercial fanfic, the amount used might be high, but the market harm is usually low. For commercial works, even if the amount used is less, the fact that it's commercial and potentially usurping a market the owner could exploit becomes the dominant issue. Unless Again, the transformation is so radical, it creates something genuinely new.
Okay, beyond the economics of copyright, there's this other fascinating, often really emotionally charged concept, moral rights. This sounds different, more personal.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
Moral rights are distinct from economic rights. They're fundamentally about protecting the author's vision, their reputation, and the integrity of their work itself. Article 6 of the Berne Convention grants authors two main moral rights: the right to claim authorship, the right of paternity.
Like getting credit.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and the right to object to any distortion, mutilation, or other modification, which would be prejudicial to his honor or reputation, the right of integrity.
Okay, so it's not about money. It's about respect for the art and the artist.
That's a good way to put it. Think about it like this. Imagine someone takes the Mona Lisa and paints a mustache on it. Maybe it doesn't hurt the economic value of the original painting, but it fundamentally disrespects Da Vinci's artistic vision and reputation. That's the essence of moral rights, protecting your work from being messed with in a way that harms your honor or standing, even if it doesn't cost you money directly.
That's a powerful analogy. So how does this play out with fan fiction, given the huge range of interpretations, some pretty wild?
This is where it gets really nuanced and can cause real conflict. Fan fiction that significantly alters the original work's background or tone, like turning a serious family drama into a slapstick comedy, or inserting very explicit content into a children's story, or drastically changing a character's morality that could potentially be seen as derogatory.
And offend the original author.
Exactly. Especially in places with strong moral rights laws, like France or Germany. For instance, 50 Shades, even though it was commercially successful and avoided copyright issues in the U.S., might face challenges under moral rights in other countries if it was deemed to have mutilated or distorted the original Twilight characters in a way that harmed the original author's reputation.
So courts have to balance the author's honor against the fan creator's freedom.
It's a delicate balancing act. They have to weigh the original author's moral rights against the fan creator's freedom of expression, especially when fan fiction can be seen as contributing to a broader cultural dialogue or exploring societal themes. It's complex.
Lastly, let's zoom out to antitrust law and the whole philosophy of the public domain. This feels like a much bigger picture view, beyond just individual stories.
It is, yeah. It's a macroeconomic and philosophical perspective. This view argues that, fundamentally, knowledge cannot be privately owned by nature, that its maximum value is realized when it's freely available to everyone in the public domain.
So IP rights should be the exception, not the rule.
Exactly. Intellectual property rights, like copyright, should be carefully limited exceptions, granted for a finite time just to incentivize creation, not as a default state of permanent ownership. Proponents argue that relying too much on things like antitrust law to regulate new cultural forms like fanfic, or having excessively long copyright terms, actually conflicts with the legislative intent of copyright law, which is supposed to encourage creation and innovation.
How does it conflict?
By restricting the public domain and stifling innovation. It keeps ideas locked away for too long, preventing the natural remixing, adaptation, and building upon that drives cultural evolution forward. They argue that constantly extending copyright terms basically starves the public domain, making it harder for future creators to draw on our shared cultural heritage.
So the suggestion here from these legal sources is that instead of relying on messy, expensive lawsuits, we need a more structured approach for fan fiction, maybe within copyright law itself.
Precisely. The legal analysis specifically recommends looking into clear legislative methods within the copyright law framework. Things like establishing appropriate compensation mechanisms, maybe ways for original creators to get a small cut if fan works are monetized, and introducing industry norms to guide how fan fiction develops in an orderly, ethical way.
That sounds sensible.
The goal would be to benefit both sides. Original creators could potentially get new revenue streams or licensing models. Fan creators would get clearer legal boundaries and less uncertainty. It fosters a more collaborative, less confrontational environment, acknowledging fan creativity instead of just ignoring or threatening it. Imagine, say, rights holders easily offering standard, non-exclusive licenses for non-commercial fan works, or platforms facilitating micropayments back to creators.
That's a lot to chew on regarding the legal and historical side. It definitely paints a much more complex, dynamic picture than most people probably assume. But now, let's shift gears to what might be the most fascinating part of this deep dive, the fanfic lens. This is this groundbreaking idea that writing fan fiction fundamentally changes how you consume all media, not just the stuff you're a fan of. It literally reshapes your brain.
This concept comes from a really insightful academic study. It was published in Participation's Journal of Audience and Reception Studies, and the title is The Fanfic Lens: Fan Writing's Impact on Media Consumption.
Okay.
The study introduces this idea of prosumers. It's a clever blend of producer and consumer.
Prosumer. Got it.
It describes this hybrid role where fans aren't just passively consuming entertainment, they're also actively, critically reinterpreting it in their own creative work. They are both audience and creator, often simultaneously.
And the study points out something that's been mostly overlooked, right? How this prosumer experience changes behavior beyond just that specific fandom engagement. It's not just about writing Star Wars fic. It changes how you watch, like, a random indie film.
That's the core idea. That's where the fanfic lens comes in. The study proposes this is a lasting fandom-sensitive attitude. It's a specific set of literacy skills you pick up from being socialized in fan communities. And it acts like a kind of permanent mental filter.
A filter.
Yeah, a cognitive framework that fan fiction authors automatically apply when they encounter any new media, a movie, a book, a game, whether they plan to write fanfic for it or not. And this isn't just a theory. The research is empirical. They did an open response online survey and semi-structured interviews from 2020 to 2021.
With who?
With a really diverse group of young adult fanfic authors aged 16 to 24 from 36 different countries. That broad global data set really strengthens their findings. It shows this lens isn't just a niche thing, it's widespread.
Okay, so let's break down how this fanfic lens actually works. The study talks about 4 different levels, right? The first is fan identity, consuming as a potential future fan. What does that mean in practice? How does someone with this lens watch a new show differently?
It means fanfic authors approach new media not just for pure entertainment. They come at it with an additional filter to determine their storytelling potentials.
Storytelling potentials?
Yeah. They're not just enjoying the ride. They're actively, almost instinctively, scanning the material, looking for things they can grab onto, things they could explore in a transformative way in their own writing. Imagine watching a news show, and in the back of your mind, you're not just following the plot. You're thinking, how could I rewrite that scene? What if the ending was different? What's really going on with that quiet side character? It's this constant subconscious evaluation of the stories, like flexibility or potential.
That is a fundamentally different way to watch something.
Yeah.
Much more active. So what specifically are they looking for? What grabs them?
The study found it's overwhelmingly about characters, their relationships, their inner lives, often much more so than just the main plot points. Participants frequently said they prefer writing about less fleshed out side characters.
Why side characters?
Because they offer a greater degree of malleability. You can adapt them, explore them, without directly contradicting the established canon as much. Fan fiction, in this sense, is often about filling in the gaps, exploring backstories, inner thoughts, motivations that the original work only hinted at.
Expanding the world through the character.
Exactly. And this leads to a deep interest in complex personalities and character dynamics, dramatic backstories, and moral ambiguity. Some authors even gravitate towards malevolent or generally unliked characters because they offer such rich psychological territory and unexplored narrative pathways. They want to understand the why behind the character's actions.
Fascinating. It's about the character's potential, not just what's already on the page or screen. One participant, Tara, even called this an instinct, right? Like a reflex.
Yeah, Tara described it as somewhat unconscious, an instinct to view fiction as an invitation for transformation. It comes from the deep habit of always extending a story's scope, looking for alternate interpretations. Another participant, Theo, echoed this, saying they approach new media with this mindset of, like, how am I going to write this?
Wow.
Theo pays special attention to characters, actively wondering which of these characters will be my character. That possessive, my character, really suggests a deep personal connection, a desire to inhabit their perspective, make them their own, and explore possibilities the original might have missed. It's a form of creative ownership.
It sounds almost like they're constantly doing this mental transmedial translation, shifting ideas from one format to another in their head.
Exactly. The study calls it that. Fan authors often practice this translation between media types. Laura, a 17-year-old American participant, said she initially found converting manga, a visual medium, into prose fanfic insane. But now, she habitually writes it in my head while watching TV shows or anime. She acknowledges it's hard. Transferring mediums, making creative choices about how to translate visual cues, or pacing into written descriptions. It's this constant cognitive workout they're doing, honing that skill. They're not just watching, they're mentally recomposing, transforming the narrative.
But this prosumer thing, this constant engagement, the fandom brain, it's not always fun, is it? Sounds like it could be exhausting, like a superpower you can't turn off.
It absolutely can be. Theo, the same participant looking for my character, described it as a constant meta-evaluation that can feel burdensome. It's like an inability to just sit back and purely enjoy a story without dissecting it, without thinking of alternatives.
Yeah, I can see that.
Sometimes authors consciously try to turn off the fandom brain. They might intentionally watch media that doesn't immediately scream fanfic potential, maybe something really abstract or super niche, just to get back to that passive enjoyment. It shows the complexity. It offers creative satisfaction, intellectual stimulation, but it can also diminish simple, passive pleasure because the producer brain is always analyzing, always seeing potential. The consumer and producer roles just run in parallel constantly.
Okay, so that's level 1, fan identity changing individual consumption. Level 2 is community perception, predicting the fandom's nature. How does being in a fanfic community change how you view other people's likely reactions to new stuff?
This is fascinating because it shifts from the individual mind to a broader social awareness. Fanfic authors develop this keen, almost predictive sense for how the larger fan community is likely to engage with new media.
Like predicting the future of the fandom.
Pretty much. This includes predicting which characters will be popular, what the common ships will be, those romantic pairings fans create, whether they're canon or not.
Yeah, shipping is huge.
Huge. They predict dominant genres or tropes within that potential fandom, like will it be mostly angst or fluff or adventure. They predict the overall level of fandom activity. And this predictive ability comes directly from being immersed in fan fiction's own idiosyncratic literary patterns, the trends and behaviors they see in their existing communities.
Can you give an example? How does that prediction work?
Sure. One participant, Renee, felt she could confidently predict that new media featuring a character like Lady Dimitrescu, the very tall vampire lady from Resident Evil, would generate a lot of fan fictions. Probably quite explicit ones.
Okay.
She said basically, you can tell sometimes after you spend enough time reading and writing in fandom how certain character designs or story setups are practically designed, consciously or not, to attract fanfic writers.
Yeah.
It shows how deeply they understand fan community dynamics and predictable responses. It's like they have this unconscious algorithm running, processing new media against past fandom trends.
So they're not just predicting fanfic content, but the whole vibe and social dynamics of a potential fandom before it even really kicks off.
Precisely. Authors also predict the fandom's general atmosphere, its culture, based on cues from the source material itself. Renee, again, contrasted the Ace Attorney fandom, which she saw as more openly supportive of various marginalized identities because of representation within the games themselves, with the Resident Evil fandom. She described that one less positively, indicating she was uncomfortable with its predicted discourse.
Discourse, meaning?
Yeah, in this context, discourse refers to the accepted behaviors, values, social norms, even the common topics of debate and argument within that specific fan community. So if she predicts a fandom's discourse will involve lots of infighting or focus on topics she finds unpleasant, that affects her desire to even engage with the fandom, regardless of the source material.
Makes sense.
But despite these predictions, sometimes cynical ones, authors also stressed that the beauty of fan fiction is its unpredictability. It often does its own thing, goes in wild directions no one expected, and that's part of the appeal.
Okay, that leads to level 3. Formal level of text comprehension, enhanced narrative analysis. How does writing fanfic actually make you a better, or at least a different kind of reader and analyst, even of mainstream stuff?
A lot of participants said their very first experiences writing longer fiction, or even just seeing themselves as storytellers, happened in fanfic spaces. That's where they learned about narrative techniques, pacing, plot structure, dialogue, character arcs, world building.
Like a practical writing workshop.
Exactly. And as a result, this immersion makes authors much more trope-aware. They get really good at spotting common narrative patterns, whether they like them or find them cliché. They see the chosen one narrative, the enemies to lovers setup, the redemption arc, instantly. It's like having literary X-ray vision.
So they're not just following the story, they're seeing the scaffolding underneath. Tara mentioned this, right? That it can sometimes take the fun out of it.
Yes. Tara said, when I read a book now, I think I'm much more trope-aware. I know what's going to happen, so sometimes it takes the fun out of it. This heightened awareness lets them anticipate plot points, critically evaluate the author's choices, maybe even predict twists way ahead. They also learn to identify standard writing stereotypes or characterizations in commercial media. Another participant, Sam, mentioned recognizing archetypes like the hunk, the twink, the airhead. And this skill helps them understand how commercial creators build characters, often using shorthand. But crucially, it also helps them figure out how to avoid reducing characters to single dimensions in their own fan writing.
So they learn what not to do from mainstream media.
Often, yes. They pinpoint tropes or stereotypes they dislike and make a conscious effort to avoid them, aiming for more nuance in their own work. Fan fiction becomes this rigorous, hands-on training ground for critical storytelling. It sharpens their analytical skills practically. It's like an apprenticeship in narrative.
Okay.
The result is this heightened, more critical awareness of narrative patterns. Both the good and the bad are problematic. They shift from being passive consumers to active, analytical participants in how stories are made. They're not just observers anymore, they're informed critics, potential collaborators, always deconstructing and reconstructing in their heads.
And that brings us to the fourth and final level, positional level, regarding agency questioning authorship and ownership. This feels like it loops right back to that Henry Jenkins quote we started with, doesn't it? About corporations owning the myths.
It absolutely does, profoundly so. Brings us full circle. Engaging with fan fiction, the study argues, fundamentally fosters critical thinking about who owns stories and who gets to say what they mean in our modern world. Participants expressed deep frustration with the traditional idea, often taught in schools, that the creator must always come above the recipient.
That the author's word is law.
Exactly. That authorial intent is paramount and untouchable. These fan creators strongly believe the audience should be allowed to count, that their interpretations, their engagement, their creative responses are valid, valuable contributions to the life of a story. Challenging that traditional artistic authority, that hierarchy, is a core part of the fanfic lens.
So fan fiction itself becomes a way to push back against that hierarchy, to claim a different kind of agency.
Precisely. Fan fiction offers a tangible way for fans to reinterpret stories on their own terms. It provides independence, if not distance, from the source text. It inherently champions the diversity of voices, promoting the idea that any interpretation, even the original author's, is ultimately subjective, just one reading among many potentially valid ones.
Interesting.
Being a fan in this context often means having an openness to think about a story beyond its canonical form. It embraces diversity, tolerance for transformation, and this mindset allows some writers to feel, perhaps controversially, that the original author did not do justice to a certain storyline or character.
So their fanfic is like a correction or an improvement.
For them, it can be. It's a means to fix something they saw as flawed or improve upon it or simply explore a path they passionately believe the original narrative should have taken. It embodies this profound sense of creative agency, the right to participate in the story.
That is a really powerful idea, that just the existence of fan fiction encourages this more active, critical way of consuming media. Stories aren't seen as these fixed, finished objects anymore, but as open invitations, open to endless possibilities, to be continued, reshaped, reimagined by anyone who connects with them deeply. It makes storytelling feel truly collaborative, constantly evolving.
It fundamentally shifts the power dynamic, doesn't it? From a single, authoritative creator to a more communal, collaborative understanding of narrative. And this last aspect of the fanfic lens really ties the other three together. When you consume media knowing that fanfiction is an option, it naturally invites you to consider future writing possibilities, to anticipate fandom interactions, and to engage in more nuanced narrative analysis while you're consuming. It becomes this constant, almost subconscious loop of intake, analysis, and potential creative output.
Wow, okay. We have covered an incredible amount of ground today. We took this remarkable deep dive, didn't we? We journeyed from fanfiction's really surprising roots in ancient communal storytelling, navigated through its intricate legal battlegrounds, copyright, fair use, all of that, and then landed on this groundbreaking idea of the fanfic lens. How this unique creative practice profoundly reshapes your perception as a media consumer. It's undeniably clear, I think, that fan fiction is so much more than just a hobby. It's this dynamic, evolving cultural force sitting right at the crossroads of history, law, psychology, and human creativity, really blurring those lines between audience and creator.
And it's important to remember that prosumer role isn't fixed. It's not like you flick a switch.
Yeah.
It's a fluid position on a spectrum. Fan fiction authors don't just become prosumers only when they're typing away. Their minds are constantly evaluating, transforming, connecting narratives, even when they're just, passively watching a movie or reading a book.
It's an ongoing mental state.
Exactly. That mental engagement is constant, influencing how they perceive every news story they encounter, subtly reshaping their cognitive landscape, whether they're consciously aware of it or not.
So to leave you, our listener, with something to think about. If deeply engaging with stories through something like fan fiction can subtly, yet fundamentally, alter how we interact with all new narratives, making us more critical, more imaginative, more aware of possibilities, what does this imply for your own creative output, whatever form that takes? How might your fandom brain, that unique blend of consumer and producer we all have to some degree, how might it empower you to rethink ownership, adapt ideas, and seek out new possibilities? Not just in fiction, but maybe in how you engage with and shape the world around you.